we're there, we think, so we'll start recording. In fact, we're now recording, and let me start by turning to you, Bapsi. You're not a historian, but your novel is a historical representation of partition. Why do you think it is that literature has been so important in portraying the human dimension of what happened in 1947?
I think it is precisely what you said, the human dimension, which is portrayed by literature. And also I feel fiction, literature seem to represent the larger truth than a narrow historical perspective, which seems to get more easily colored by prejudice and bias. Whereas in literature, you are free to, sort of wander around and somehow arrive, I feel, at the larger perspective and the larger truth.
Now, Urvashi Butalia...
What happened to the ordinary people, yeah.
But Urvashi Butalia, you've written one of the landmark social histories of partition, a very recent trend in Indian or South Asian historiography. You've not used literature a great deal in that social history, but do you accept that literature has affected the way in which partition has been perceived?
Yes, very much actually. I think, in fact, the only sort of writing in which people have been able to address the, the hidden histories or the underlying dimensions of partition is in literature. It's not, unfortunately, it's not as much as it could be in volume given the scale of the event, but even so, I think that that's the only place where it has been addressed, where those larger truths that Bapsi is speaking about have been addressed, and very, very poignantly, in a very moving way. And I think it's possible to do it, to go back to the question you were posing earlier to Bapsi, perhaps because it is easier to locate those kinds of painful experiences in the realm of fiction.
But why do you think...
to remove them.
But why do you think historians in both India and Pakistan have been so slow in addressing the human aspect, the social aspect of partition?
I think partly the answer which I'm discovering is that men seem to be historians, and they're always more interested in the politics of a situation rather than in what happened to the common men, the common men and women, as Urvashi has so beautifully written in a book about the women and what their histories. They've been totally ignored. And men feel, that perspective is not so important as the perspective of, let's say, what Nehru, Gandhi or Jinnah did. And that is why this perspective has been largely ignored.
But Bapsi, I agree, but in fact I think that's very important what you say, that by and large the histories that we have been written by men, and therefore the experience of the common person has been left out. But in addition, I think there are a number of other things. One of them, I think, is that it does take a certain amount of time before people can come back to a particularly painful history to address the painful dimensions of it or to confront them. I think that process is beginning, at least in India right now. I don't know if it's beginning in Pakistan. Then I think that the people who have lived through partition, they are now in their 70s and 80s, and perhaps they are wanting a little more to speak out now than they were previously. And also, again, the reality of communal sectarian conflict in India has made it so important for us to try and understand what happened and why we've got to this, this polarization of identities on the basis of religion between communities who did live together. So I think it's a combination of all of those things which is making these histories surface now.
Yes, and that even not enough is being done. Another factor was that the archives, the letters were not available until quite recently. And one of the books which has been, for me, a very defining moment in our history, which sort of talks about it very clearly, is a book by an Indian historian called Sidhwa on partition.
Yes, yeah.
And that was an eye-opener for me, I think, just through writing the letters which were exchanged, publishing them, and making brief comments on them. I think it revealed much more about the partition than was known before.
Yeah, and you're right about these documents not being available, and even though they've opened them up now, still there are a lot of things which are not easily accessible to scholars to be able to study them.
Yes, and there has to be a stronger will to study them also. I think part of that will, it is really, as you mentioned, still a very emotional topic because the partition is not over. It is going on, and it is still too emotional to talk about. So the historical perspective is not without prejudice and bias, generally.
But
At least that's what I find in Pakistan.
You say, Bapsi, that the legacy of partition still lingers. Both your families have been very directly affected by what happened in 1947. You've approached recording it from different traditions, one as a novelist, the other as a historian, but have you approached it with the same purpose, to supersede partition in social, communal, political terms? Bapsi?
I'm not very clear about your question.
Well,
it sounds a little academic.
Is your purpose in writing novels about partition, particularly Ice Candy Man, is it in a sense a political purpose, not a directly political purpose, but trying to heal the wounds?
Well, yes, perhaps that. Also, just laying bare what happened. It is very important to know what did occur. You cannot just put a veil over it and ignore it, because we do need to know our history so that we can probably, if such a thing is possible, learn some lessons from it and see what a lot of harm was done. Now that the film of Ice Candy Man has been made called Earth, this has sort of opened a lot of discussions, and young people are saying, you know, we didn't know this had occurred during the partition. It's part of our history, and how come we didn't know? And it has been important, I think, for them to know where bias, prejudice and hatred can lead one.
Yeah, if I can come in on that question as well. My purpose in writing the kind of history that I have done is very squarely a political purpose. It grows very squarely out of my commitment to a secular India, which is what I strongly believe in. And, you know, as a secular Indian, I'm disturbed by the kind of polarization, by the kind of hatred between communities that we are witnessing now. And I do believe that it's important to go back to the history of partition, where a lot of this, explodes. I wouldn't say it takes its source from, because the differences have always existed, but a lot of it comes to a kind of head at that time. And I think we need to understand that, because in individual and collective memory, inside families particularly, which is where this history of partition is largely contained, it's very one-sided. You hear from families about their victimhood, but you never hear about their involvement in the violence. And I think that it's really important to look at ordinary people and see what it is that makes people turn to violence against their neighbors and friends, and sometimes even against their relatives, because there are mixed marriages and so on. And Bapsi's book in this regard has been quite amazing. You know, the film, the new life the book has got after the film. And about a month ago, I was telling Bapsi I was in a school in Delhi where the students of the 11th and 10th standard were set an assignment to read Ice Candy Man and to come back and discuss it. And just the reaction to this history or to this story was quite amazing, because many of the students said, you know, we read it, we couldn't sleep all night. Many of the others said they had never known that this kind of history existed, and they were questioning the veracity of it because they saw it in a book of fiction. But when they heard that it actually was true, you know, they began to think quite a lot about their own attitudes, their own histories. So in that sense, fiction or historical work, I think it makes a lot of difference.
It touches the emotions.
Yes.
Fiction can, go beneath the skin and touch your emotions, involve them, show you what jealousy, vendetta, revenge, what these feelings are and how they worked out, and show you the sadness of what the events that happened. But here there's one very interesting phenomena I have discovered, and that is that people who directly suffered harm, who were dislocated, who had to flee their homelands, who are really pained by what happened during the partition, they seem to have, to some extent, rebuilt their lives and, to an extent, forgiven each other. On both sides of the border, I found that. But people who have not been involved in this, like people in far-out Maharashtra and Gujarat, whom the partition did not touch at all, they have turned sort of virulently anti-Muslim now, I feel. And this is where I say the partition is continuing, because I feel that hatred is being whipped up, and it is a fearsome thing to watch.
Bapsi, I'm going to interrupt just for a second. I think you're now getting slightly too close to the microphone, and you're slightly distorting as a result. If you're able to get your mouth perhaps just about a couple of inches further from the further away from the microphone, that would, I think...
Is that better?
I think it is.
Is that better?
Yes, that certainly is.
Or maybe I'm screeching too much.
No, it's not that you're screeching. But to try and get us back into the discussion mode, it is quite remarkable, isn't it? It seems to be quite remarkable the different ways in which partition is still perceived in the two countries, different sides of the partition line, 53 years later. In India, it is still hardly possible to say publicly that partition was right. In Pakistan, it's certainly not possible to say publicly that partition was wrong.
You're absolutely right there, Andrew, because I feel I'm straddling a fence, being now an American citizen. Also, I've been Pakistani and Indian. And I find that most Indians feel that can't we be one again? And I said, look, you have to accept it. Pakistan is a reality. It's 50 years. You're not going to be one again. And they say if East and West Germany can be one, why not Pakistan and India? But the reasons for the divide are quite different. In Germany, there was a yearning to be close. Out here, there is this polarization, a religious polarization. And in Pakistan, they feel, oh my God, if we had not had partition, we would have been sitting in the position the Indian Muslims are sitting today. And they do feel that the Indian Muslims are suffering a lot. That is their perception. I don't think it is the perception of the Muslims yet to that extent. But this is how it is perceived.
But I think in some ways it's also quite interesting the fact that that in Pakistan you don't have the same kind of exploration of partition that we are beginning to get here in India now, and also beginning to get somewhat in Bangladesh, where it is much more closely woven with the history of 1971. But it's there, and people are wanting to look into what happened to people's lives. And I think perhaps that is partly because partition, for us, what is the loss of a part of yourself, or a part of the nation, or a part of the territory of the nation and the people, is for Pakistan the birth of independence and a gaining of a particular kind of identity. So perhaps there isn't that kind of sadness at it, except, Bapsi, don't you think, among the people who went from here to there, the Muslims who moved from here to there, there's still quite a lot of that yearning for homeland and connectivity with their relatives and so on.
Yes, of course, because once you're removed from your roots have a tremendous draw on you. And that is one of the big tragedies of partition, that people have been dislocated. People are yearning to be, they don't want to feel that the other part of the border is not their soil, because they know it is in their blood, it is part of their soil. In that respect, partition has really hurt a lot of people.
Bapsi,
yes?
Bapsi, I read somewhere a comment of yours when you said that one of the reasons you wrote Ice Candy Man was to try and dispel, as you put it, certain erroneous and biased views that had come about in other writing, which was, you said, unfair to Muslims generally. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, if naturally when the Indians write it, it will reflect the Indian, or if the Hindus write it, it will reflect the Hindu point of view. When the British write it, they will portray themselves more favorably. And there has not been enough writing from the Pakistan side, especially, which would give a dispassionate view. So I felt I did need to write this. Just a very dispassionate, objective view, because that itself would carry a fairer perspective.
But it isn't an objective view, is it? No, I mean, not in the sense of being either a Pakistani view or an Indian view, but it is the view of somebody who is very emotionally very disturbed at what happened and very engaged with it, and does not, quite clearly feels that it should not have happened in the way that it did happen. So the whole power of that account is because it isn't actually objective.
Well, let's say objective has so many meanings, but I would try to say it is a fair point of view,
yes,
who does justice to both sides. And here I thought it was very important that the child be a Parsi child, as I am, because the Parsi is Zoroastrian, the minority community, which is now still in India and Pakistan, are not Hindu, Muslim and Sikh, which is important, because the Parsis were not involved directly in the struggle, and that way I felt one could bring dispassion to the subject. Also, it is a child's perspective of the partition. It is viewed through the child's eye, which is of course informed by the adult consciousness. But when I wrote the book, I inhabited the child's persona, and it is amazing how I was able to shed the prejudices which I had learned. We all learn prejudices. We all learn to hate from our elders and to have our points of view. But inhabiting the child's persona helped me shed this, so that I find my book is equally liked, whether it's India or Pakistan, and both feel it is dispassionate. And after all, these are the people who judge the book. I mean, to me, it does not matter what the British or Americans think, because they don't have a point by which they can judge it, And the Indians and Pakistanis, if they find it authentic, that is truly then what matters to me.
But Urvashi, Bapsi seemed to be suggesting that a Hindu perspective on history, a history written by a Hindu or by a Sikh, I presume, by extension, could not be a dispassionate and objective history. Do you accept that?
Well, yes and no. I think, the histories that we have available to us of partition in, let us say, the academic histories, I wouldn't call them Hindu, I wouldn't call their perspective a Hindu perspective, but I would certainly say that quite a number of them have internalized the Indian perspective of believing without question, if you like, until very recently, that it was, the Congress was reluctant to accept partition, and the Muslim League and Jinnah were the ones who were pushing for partition. It's only in recent exploration, and that also by a Pakistani historian, Aisha Jalal, that it's become clear that that was not the case. And now Indian historians are also beginning to explore that. So I would not call it a Hindu perspective, but I would say yes, certainly it is a perspective that to some extent carries a bias, an Indian nationalist bias, if you like, within quotes, using the word nationalist within quotes. But there are, Andy, a number of other histories in both countries. Histories or, textbooks that are used in schools, which of course are amazingly biased and shockingly biased in how they project not only the event of partition or not only the history of partition, but the sort of characteristics that they assign to Hindus and Muslims. And it's not as if in those India is any cleaner than Pakistan is, because you actually get exactly the same thing on both sides of the border. And I think that's the terrible thing. We got that before, we had that to some extent in India before we had a right-wing government. We have it much more consciously, much stronger now. And that to me is the much more worrying thing, because it's at school level where this is what children are learning.
They're learning to hate each other.
Exactly, yes.
Andrew, I think I misrepresented myself. I don't feel that all Hindu perspectives are at fault, but or all Indian perspectives are at fault. There have been many dispassionate accounts by Indian historians. In fact, the one I quoted, Sidhwa, was after all an Indian historian. But there is, as Urvashi said, on both sides of the border, a tendency to doctor history to suit their own ideology of each country.
Yeah, that's really...
Sorry, Urvashi, you
go on. No, I was going to say that's really good. I mean, I have some of those things here with me, actually, which, a paper which quotes from some of those histories, and they are really quite shocking. I was just reading them last night.
Could you quote them? I think that would be interesting.
I don't know. Andy?
Yeah.
Does that interest you at all?
Yeah, sure, do. Go ahead.
Hang on. I have to fish it out of my handbag. Why don't you carry on talking, Bapsi, while I just get this out.
It is still a very painful subject, the thought of the partition, the tearing apart of a country. It almost seems as if when the earth is divided, it sort of demands blood, it demands sacrifice. Every time new borders are defined, they seem to cry out for blood, and there is slaughter. We've seen this happening recently in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in East Timor, and it is happening every day for the past 50 years in Kashmir. That subject does need to be resolved.
So you're saying that the legacy of partition is still alive and haunting South Asia?
Yes, it is haunting. In fact, attitudes I find recently have hardened, and we're on a very dangerous, the worst condition of relationship which has existed between our countries is probably now.
Yeah, I think that's true. Here's something I have from a textbook in Pakistan, which is describing Hindu-Muslim relations pre-independence, and it says there was nothing common in religion, ways of living, and customs and rights between the two nations, and the two nations are the Hindus and Muslims. And it goes on to talk about Iqbal being the first to present the idea of Pakistan. And then it talks about 1971, and it says Bharat, that's India, engineered riots on a large scale through her agents and some mischievous people. Later she attacked East Pakistan from 4 sides, and thus Pakistan had to fight a war with Bharat. This lasted 3 weeks, and after that East Pakistan separated and became Bangladesh. So this is, from the other side, and then I'll read you something from one of our histories, which is no better actually. It's, I have to find that. Well, this is, talking about medieval history. The book that I've got from India, it's about medieval history, and it talks about monuments and temples and so on, and it goes on to blame the Muslims who devastated everything, and it says they destroyed many idols, they of the value of 400 weights of 5 missiles, which is a measure, 5 missiles each, and from 2 feet of an idol they obtained the weight of 400,000 mistals of gold, and the idols of silver were 100 times more. So they devastated all of this, and the destruction of such exquisite works of architecture and sculpture has been an enormous loss to humanity. It has also an enormous blot on the teachings of a faith which Mahmud followed, that is Mahmud of Ghazni, and the cause of which he championed. And from Mathura, Mahmud proceeded to Vrindavan, which he too sacked and plundered, and so on. You get a whole, this is really quite vituperative and dangerous stuff, and you get it increasingly in school textbooks.
We're actually running out of studio time at this end, so I'm going to ask you what you both seem to be saying is that popular depictions, perceptions, representations of partition and of relations between Hindu and Muslims in India and Pakistan are actually hardening divisions between the two traditions, the two communities and the two countries.
Yes, I would agree there.
Yeah, I think that's happening at a political level, although I think something else is happening at a people-to-people level. I think that despite all the rhetoric, people do want to actually stay in contact, to visit, to meet, and they do yearn to go across to each other's countries.
They do, that is true, but there is this rigidity creeping into the consciousness, even of the common man, I'm noticing,
you were
in
saying
India and in Pakistan, and the rigidity is almost entirely to do with Kashmir.
Yeah, I think you're right there.
I think
Andy, do you want us to go on?
I think we're going to have to stop at this end, I'm afraid, because we're going to lose the studio now. And I think perhaps if we explore Kashmir, we're probably going beyond the initial intention, at least, of the discussion. So I think we'll leave it there, and let me express very great thanks to both of you for coming in. As I say, the radio version will probably go out sometime in the next few days, and I'll get the discussion transcribed, and I will send you a slightly edited transcript and see if you think it represents accurately what you want to say, and if you'd be happy for it to go into print. Are you both okay
Andrew,
with that?
do you?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, fine.
Do you have my American address, Andrew?
I've got your... yeah, go on, tell me, yeah?
It's 5442
Yeah.
China